Adeline Mercer had exactly $10 left in her apron pocket, and she already knew what those $10 had to do: a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and bus fare to visit her sister on Sunday morning. She had counted it 3 times that day, each time folding the bill into quarters and pushing it deep into her pocket, as if she were afraid it might walk away on its own. But at 8:17 that evening, an elderly woman walked into Ruby's diner, sat down at table number 4, finished an entire bowl of chicken soup, and only then looked up with confusion in her eyes. She had no wallet. She could not remember how many streets she had crossed to get there. She could not even remember her own name. She began to tremble, her hands searching through every pocket, apologizing over and over to a waitress she had never met before. Adeline did not ask who she was. She did not ask where she lived, or whether anyone was coming for her. She simply took out her last $10, placed it quietly on the tray, and told the woman to stay a while longer where it was warm. The old woman gripped her hand so tightly that it hurt, and wept. Adeline had no idea that at that very moment, a man was standing in the doorway behind her, watching everything unfold. Less than an hour later, the door of that small diner opened again. A black car stopped at the curb, and that man walked in and set down one question on the counter that made the owner sit down. She had no idea whose hand she had just taken. If you believe that one small act of kindness can still change an entire life, please leave us a like. Share this story with someone you think needs a little hope right now. And don't forget to subscribe, so you can join us for more stories about the goodness that lives in ordinary people. The man didn't go around the counter the way other customers did. He walked straight past 3 rows of tables, one step at a time, slow and steady, as though the entire room had been standing still, waiting for him for a very long time. When he reached them, he lowered himself onto one knee beside the chair where the old woman sat, bringing his eyes level with hers, and softly called, "Mother." The whole diner fell silent. The man at the table in the back let his chopsticks drop. Even the owner, who had been wiping a glass, stopped where he stood. The old woman stared at him for a long time, her eyes still as bewildered as they had been when she was searching through her pockets. Then she nodded, not the way someone nodded upon recognizing her own son, but the way a person agreed to follow a gentle voice. He took both her hands in his, rubbed them to warm them, and held them that way for several seconds without saying another word. Then he looked up at Adeline. "Why did you do that?" Adeline didn't understand the question at first. She stood straight behind the tray, her hands still damp with dishwater. She was frightened, she said. No one should have to be hungry and afraid at the same time. He studied her for another moment. There was something in his gaze that made Adeline uneasy, not because it was fierce, but because he was calmly weighing her, the way someone might weigh a piece of merchandise to determine whether it had been switched. "People usually ask for something back after they give," he said. "They just wait a little longer before they do." "Then you must be talking about someone else," Adeline replied. Behind her, the owner cleared his throat softly, the kind of warning meant to remind an employee to mind her manners. Adeline didn't turn around. The man wasn't angry. The corner of his mouth even moved slightly, though it never quite became a smile. "What's your name?" Adeline didn't answer. She merely lifted one hand and pointed to the plastic name tag pinned to her uniform, the one she'd worn for 4 years and not a single customer had ever bothered to ask about. He read it, nodded once, then rose to his feet. He didn't ask how much the bowl of soup cost. He didn't ask who had paid for it, nor did he reach for his wallet, as Adeline had half expected and half hoped he wouldn't. He simply slipped one hand beneath the old woman's elbow, helped her to her feet, straightened her collar, and guided her toward the door, moving so slowly that Adeline could clearly hear the soles of the woman's shoes dragging across the tile floor. Halfway there, the old woman suddenly stopped. She turned her head and searched, looking all around the diner until her eyes found Adeline. Then she called out, her voice hoarse but unmistakably clear, far too clear to be misunderstood. "Colette." Adeline went completely still. The tray was still in her hands, and she felt it grow strangely heavy. Colette was her mother's name. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, and the old woman didn't wait. She simply looked at her for one more second with the gentle reproach of an old acquaintance who hadn't seen her in years, then allowed the man to lead her onward. But it was the man who faltered. He stopped in the doorway, one hand still resting on the open door, and turned his head to look at Adeline. 3 seconds. Adeline counted all 3 because, during those 3 seconds, she could clearly hear the refrigerator humming behind her. He didn't ask whether she knew that name. She didn't ask why his mother had called her by it. They had both witnessed what had just happened, and they both chose not to touch it. Then he turned away, guided the old woman down the front step, and the door closed behind them. Adeline remained motionless for another moment before carrying the tray into the kitchen. She turned on the faucet, washed the bowl, placed it on the rack, wiped down table 4, and set the chair upright. There were thousands of people in the world named Colette, she told herself. A confused old woman could call anyone by any name. She had reached the 3rd table before she realized that both her hands were still trembling. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and only 2 people remained in the diner. Adeline was turning the chairs upside down on the tables in the same order she'd followed for 4 years, working from the inside outward, while Otis Pike sat at the counter counting the money in the register, counting slowly, then counting it again, something he'd done every night for the past several months, without his face ever looking brighter when he finished. Then, a sweep of headlights crossed the front window. The black car pulled up against the curb, into the same spot where it had been parked less than an hour earlier. Pike closed the register drawer. Adeline lowered the chair in her hands onto the floor instead of placing it upside down on the table, and she didn't understand why she'd done it. The door opened. The man entered alone, without the old woman, and this time, he didn't walk past the 3 rows of tables. He stopped at the counter. "My name is Emmett Falcone," he said to Pike. "I need to speak with the owner." Pike placed one hand on the edge of the counter. Adeline saw it clearly. She saw his fingers clutching the worn wood, and she understood that he wasn't doing it for comfort. He was doing it to keep himself steady. For months, everyone in the neighborhood had been whispering about the same thing, that someone was buying up every property along the harbor, that the laundromat next door had changed hands, that the old bookstore at the end of the street had closed, and its windows had been covered with paper. No one knew exactly who the buyer was. They only knew that when his lawyers called, people were rarely left with many choices. Now Pike knew the man's name. "I'm the owner," he said. Emmett nodded. He looked around once, taking in the low ceiling, the boards covering the gaps near the door, and the sign hanging backward inside the window. Then he asked Pike directly how much he wanted for rubies. Pike thought he'd misheard and asked him to repeat himself. Emmett repeated the question word for word, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, then named a price himself. Adeline stood behind the counter with a cleaning cloth in her hand, and when she heard the amount, she felt something inside her chest drop. It wasn't a reasonable number. It was the kind of number offered by a man who had no need to bargain, and she'd lived long enough to know that when someone offered more than a thing was worth, there was always another price hidden somewhere out of sight. Pike didn't look pleased either. He remained silent for so long that Emmett had no choice but to wait. Then Pike asked, "What are you buying it for?" Emmett didn't answer at once. He turned his head, and Adeline realized he was looking at her. She tightened her grip on the cloth. "Because tonight I saw something I haven't been able to buy anywhere," Emmett said. Pike followed his gaze, looked at Adeline, then turned back to Emmett. Adeline felt heat rise into her face, not because she was flattered, but because she had suddenly become part of something she'd never chosen to be involved in. She wanted to say that she hadn't done anything, that anyone in her place would have done the same, but she remained silent. "And what about my people?" Pike asked. "I've got 4 employees here. One of them has been with me since my wife was still alive." "No one loses their job," Emmett said. "The diner keeps its name. The sign stays where it is." Then he raised one hand and pointed toward the table against the wall, table 4. The one Adeline had wiped down not long before. "And from now on that table stays empty. Don't seat customers there. Anyone who walks through that door with nothing in their pockets sits in that exact place, and no one asks them a single question." Pike looked at the table. Then he pulled out the nearest chair, sat down, and remained there in silence for a while. He'd built this diner after his wife died, named it after her, and 3 times in the past 3 months, he'd considered taking down the sign. "Bring me the papers," he finally said. Emmett took out a set of documents that had already been prepared. That sent a deeper chill down Adeline's spine than anything else that had happened, because it meant everything that night had been calculated before he walked through the door for the 2nd time. Pike signed. Emmett put the papers away, thanked him with a few brief words, then returned to his car. The door closed, and the sound of the engine gradually faded into the distance. Pike remained seated, both hands resting on his thighs. "Go home," he told Adeline without looking up. "It's late." Adeline hung the cloth on its hook. She should have felt relieved because the diner had just been saved, because her job was secure. But as she walked home that night, she felt the exact opposite. She felt as though a man she hadn't invited had just stepped into her life, and she had no idea how long he intended to stay. On Sunday morning, Adeline walked to the rehabilitation center because there was no money left for the bus, and she left 40 minutes earlier than usual so she could arrive in time for Junie's therapy session. Junie was 19 years old, standing between two parallel bars, her hands gripping them so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and with every step, her whole body tilted to one side before she forced herself upright again. The moment she saw her sister, she smiled, the same kind of smile she always used as a distraction, and said that today was much easier than yesterday, that her leg hardly hurt at all and was only a little tired. Adeline looked at her sister's hands and knew she was lying, but she didn't expose the lie, because both sisters in that family were lying to each other about different things, and they both knew it made life easier to bear. Junie walked the full length of the bars, turned around, and made another pass. Then, halfway through, she suddenly said that when Dad was alive, he was always telling her to stand up straight, because if she stood up straight, she could go anywhere. Adeline bent down to adjust the brace around her sister's knee and asked what she wanted for lunch so she could bring it upstairs. Junie went blank for a second before saying anything would be fine, and the name that had just been spoken fell to the floor between the two sisters, with neither of them willing to pick it up. When the session ended, Adeline went down to the payment counter with the notice in her hand, the one she'd spent 2 days calculating over, trying to determine how long she might ask them to wait. The clerk checked the computer and told her that the bill for that month had already been paid in full. Adeline said there must be some mistake. The clerk checked again and said there wasn't. Someone had come in on Thursday and paid in cash, leaving no name, refusing a receipt, and offering no explanation of his relationship to the patient. Adeline stood at the counter for a long while. She asked whether the person had been a man or a woman, and the clerk said it was an older man with silver hair who hadn't said much. Adeline thanked her and walked away, but she didn't feel relieved at all. She felt as though a cord had just been tied around her wrist, and she had no idea where the other end of it was. When she reached the hallway, Cyrus Dunn was already waiting beside the vending machine with a thin stack of papers in his hand, holding it up the way someone might hold out an invitation. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He simply greeted her with perfect courtesy, opened the papers, and turned to the page bearing her signature from 2 years earlier, from the night she'd sat at her kitchen table and signed because there was nowhere else left to borrow from. That debt had nothing to do with the hospital. It belonged to her alone, carried her name, and to this day it continued to grow steadily every week, like something alive. He read aloud the interest due that week. Then he read the total. Then he folded the papers shut and said he wasn't a cruel man, that he understood her circumstances, and that he had a way out for her. He owned a pawn shop in the lower part of town. The books were a mess, and he needed someone who kept careful records and knew how to keep her mouth shut. It would only be 3 evenings a week. Her wages would be deducted directly from the debt, and within a year, everything would be settled cleanly. Adeline asked him what she would be recording. He said there was nothing complicated about bookkeeping, only what came in, what went out, who brought it, and who took it away. Adeline said no. He asked once more, still speaking gently. She said no again, more briefly this time. He nodded, slipped the papers inside his coat, and told her to think about it, that he would stop by the diner the following week. Then, before leaving, he glanced once toward the hallway leading to the floor where Junie had her therapy. Only once. He didn't say another word. That night, Adeline arrived home close to 11 o'clock. She opened the refrigerator, stood staring into it for a while, then closed it again. She poured herself a full glass of water and drank every drop. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and called her sister. And when Junie asked how things had gone at the diner that day, Adeline said the place had been packed, so busy she could barely catch her breath, and that she'd made good money in tips. She promised she would buy Junie a new coat the following week. Junie laughed over the phone and told her not to buy one, that she should use the money to feed herself properly instead. Adeline said she would. She said she'd already eaten. She'd eaten at the diner. 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon was the dead hour at Ruby's. The hour when the only sounds in the entire diner were the ceiling fan turning overhead and Adeline rearranging the sugar jars on the tables. And that was when Emmett Falcone walked in. Pike was in the kitchen. When he heard the bell above the door, he stuck his head out, saw who it was, then withdrew again, and Adeline understood that from now on, there would be no one in that diner willing to stand between her and this man. Emmett sat on a stool at the counter, not at table 4, and ordered a cup of black coffee like an ordinary customer. Adeline poured the coffee, set it in front of him, then stepped back half a pace. "You studied nursing for 3.5 years?" Emmett said. Adeline's hand went still on the cleaning cloth. She hadn't told anyone in the diner about that except Pike, and even he knew only the barest details. She didn't ask how Emmett knew, because she suspected the question wouldn't be answered, and because a voice inside her warned that anyone capable of discovering that much almost certainly knew far more. "Then I quit," she said. "I left halfway through my final year." "I know. Then why are you asking?" "I'm not asking. I'm telling you so you'll understand that I didn't come here with some vague offer." He took a sip of coffee and set the cup down. "My mother needs someone with her during the day, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. I want that person to be you." Adeline laughed, a short sound that held no amusement. "You could hire an entire hospital," she said. "You could hire 3 people to work in shifts, every one of them fully qualified, every one of them better than I am. Why me?" "I've already done that," Emmett said. 4 people in 8 months. One lasted 3 weeks. The longest stayed 9. Because she's difficult? Because she was afraid of them. She looked at them as though they were strangers in her own home, and she wasn't wrong. That's exactly what they were. He raised his eyes to hers. "But she remembered your name, and she can't even remember mine." Adeline said nothing. That name lay between them once again, and just as before, neither of them reached down to pick it up. She stood behind the counter, the cloth still in her hand, and thought about the papers inside Cyrus Dunn's coat, about the glance he'd cast toward the hallway, about the bill someone had paid in cash that month without leaving a name. Then she thought of the old woman gripping her hand so tightly that it hurt. "If I accept," she said, "I have some conditions." "Go ahead. I keep my night shift here. I work for you during the day, leave at 6 in the evening, and report here at 7. I'm not leaving this place." Emmett nodded. "Second, you pay me by the hour. Exactly what a nurse earns in this city, not 1 cent more. If you want to verify the rate, go ask around yourself." "Agreed." "Third, no gifts, no envelopes, no food to take home, no car to drive me back and forth, and none of your people suddenly appearing somewhere to help me. I won't take an advance on my wages, no matter what happens. If I need money, I'll find my own way to manage." He studied her longer than he had after the first 3 conditions. "Anything else?" "One more thing." Adeline placed the cloth on the counter. "I don't want to know what you do for a living. Don't tell me, and I won't ask. I'll come to your house to care for a sick woman, and when my hours are over, I'll leave. Your business is your own." The diner fell silent. The ceiling fan kept turning. Emmett picked up his coffee cup, then set it down again without drinking. "I agree to the first 3 conditions," he said. "Put them in writing, and I'll sign. And the last one? I can't promise you that." Adeline looked at him. "Why not?" "Because that isn't in my hands," Emmett said. "You'll find out for yourself. Sooner or later, you'll find out." He rose, took out his wallet, and paid for the coffee, placing the exact price printed on the menu upon the counter, without a single extra dollar, and Adeline understood that he had obeyed her 3rd condition within the very first minute. After taking 2 steps, he stopped. "I only hope it's later," he said without turning around. Then he walked out of the diner. Adeline stood behind the counter and stared at the small bill lying on the worn wood for a long time. Then she opened the register, placed the money inside, and before she closed the drawer, she realized that her hand was trembling again, exactly as it had that night. On Monday morning, Adeline stood before the iron gates in Roland Park with a canvas bag holding 2 changes of clothes and her mother's cloth-bound notebook, and she remained there longer than necessary before pressing the bell. The man who opened the gate was elderly, with silver hair and a back that was still straight, and when he reached out to take her bag, Adeline immediately remembered the description. An older man, silver hair, didn't say much. Her heart missed a beat. "Amos Teague," he said. "I drive for this family." She handed him the bag. He lifted it easily, but instead of walking ahead to lead the way, he stayed where he was and looked at her for quite some time, with a gaze that held nothing impolite but made no attempt to conceal itself either. "Are you certain?" he asked. Adeline didn't know what the question referred to, whether it meant the job, this house, or something else she hadn't yet learned. But she didn't ask him to explain. "No," she said. Amos nodded once, as though that was precisely the answer he'd expected, then turned and walked inside. The ground floor hallway was long and cool, and Adeline had made it only halfway down when someone stepped out of the study and blocked her path. The man appeared to be in his mid-40s. He wore a shirt without a tie and carried a file in one hand, and he looked her up and down the way someone inspected merchandise. "You're Miss Mercer?" "Yes." "Bram Kessler." He didn't offer his hand. "I manage everything concerning this family. If you need anything, you speak to me. Don't trouble Mr. Falcone." Adeline said she understood. He remained where he was, making no move to let her pass. "Over the past 8 months, I've escorted 4 people out through the same gate you just entered," he said. "Outsiders don't remain in this house for long." Then he stepped aside. Amos stood at the foot of the stairs without saying anything, simply waiting for her to reach him. Rosalind's room was on the 2nd floor. The door stood open, and she was sitting beside the window with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Adeline tapped lightly on the doorframe and stepped inside. But before she could decide how to introduce herself, the old woman looked up, saw her, and her face lit up like someone who had unexpectedly encountered an old friend in the street. "Well, there you are," she said. "It's you." She pushed herself to her feet, took 2 steps forward, and clasped Adeline's hand, and Adeline let her hold it. Rosalind patted the back of her hand several times, the way elderly people did with someone they cherished, then narrowed her eyes at Adeline with gentle reproach. "Why haven't you been on duty all this time?" Adeline stood motionless. Outside in the hallway, someone's footsteps passed the door and gradually faded away. She looked at Rosalind's 2 hands holding hers, at the thin, veined fingers that were warmer than she'd expected, and she opened her mouth but couldn't find a single thing to say. Rosalind waited for a moment, then let the matter go. She forgot what she'd just asked, turned toward the cup of tea, and complained that it had gone cold, that someone had made it that morning and no one had bothered to replace it. Adeline said she would make her a fresh cup. Rosalind told her to make it weak, not too strong. For the rest of that day, she didn't ask the question again, and Adeline didn't mention it to anyone. At 6 o'clock that evening, she returned to the diner, worked her night shift, and didn't close until 11:30. The following morning, she came back to the house. 3 days later, Emmett asked her to stay overnight twice a week, because Rosalind often woke after midnight. Adeline agreed on the condition that those hours be deducted precisely from her regular schedule, and that she receive no additional pay. On the first night she stayed over, Adeline got up to fetch some water at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. The lights were still on downstairs. She reached the top of the stairs and stopped because she could hear Emmett in the hallway below, listening to someone on the phone. He didn't argue, raise his voice, or offer an explanation. He simply listened for a long time, then spoke exactly 4 words. "Shut down Pier 4. Then he ended the call. Adeline stepped backward, returned to her room, and lay down without getting any water. It was business at the harbor, she told herself. People with companies had docks, and when they had docks, sometimes one of them had to be closed. There was nothing frightening about shutting down a pier. She closed her eyes and listened to her heart beating against the pillow for a very long time. During the first week, Rosalind called her Colette more than a dozen times, and Adeline never corrected her once. She had studied long enough to know that when someone forgot, the worst thing you could do was drag them back into your world, because every time they were pulled back, they had to realize they had lost one more thing. During the 4 months she had spent training in the geriatric ward before leaving school, she had watched it happen dozens of times. Someone would say something as gentle as, "You're mistaken. Try to remember," or, "You don't have a daughter by that name," and then the patient would sit in silence, their face darkening, refusing to speak for the rest of the afternoon. So Adeline did the opposite. She stepped into Rosalind's world and remained there. When Rosalind said the tea had been sitting there since morning, Adeline made a fresh cup, even if the one before her had been poured only 10 minutes earlier. When Rosalind said 4 o'clock was tea time, Adeline brought her tea at 4 o'clock, exactly at 4, neither early nor late, because it was one of the few points in the day Rosalind could still hold on to, and Adeline didn't want it to shift. When Rosalind asked whether anyone else was on duty that day, Adeline told her it was just the 2 of them. When she complained that the window was letting in a draft, Adeline closed it. On the 3rd day, Rosalind began to sing, half-heartedly at first, managing only a few lines before forgetting the words and stopping in frustration. Adeline sang the next line for her. Rosalind turned sharply and stared at her, then joined in, and together they sang the entire song, an old song Adeline's mother used to sing while washing the dishes. But Adeline didn't think about that then. She simply sang. From that day forward, Rosalind wanted to sing every afternoon. The trouble began on Thursday, when Dr. Von Keeler arrived for his routine examination. He opened his case, took out the daily schedule he had personally prepared, and checked every line. Breakfast at 7 o'clock, memory exercises at 9, rest at 10, physical activity at 11, an afternoon nap at 1, and a second memory session at 3. You give her tea at 4 o'clock, he said. There is no 4 o'clock on this schedule. She remembers 4 o'clock, Adeline said. She doesn't remember 9. It's an exercise, Miss Mercer. Exercises have to follow a schedule. Yesterday, I tried giving her the card sorting exercise at 9 o'clock. She did it for 3 minutes, then tore the paper out of my hand and told me she wasn't a child. After that, she didn't speak a word to me until noon. Keeler looked at her over the rims of his glasses. Are you the nurse or the doctor? I'm neither, Adeline said. I only sit with her for 10 hours every day. He folded the schedule, returned it to his case, then spent a long time writing something in Rosalind's medical record before leaving. Adeline couldn't read what he had written, and she didn't ask. She simply recorded the date and time in her mother's cloth-bound notebook, along with one brief line noting that the doctor had visited and hadn't been pleased. Then she closed the notebook and slipped it into her canvas bag. 3 weeks passed that way. Rosalind still wandered through the house and lost her way. There were still mornings when she sat crying without knowing what she was crying about. Sometimes she asked Adeline where her husband had gone and why he wasn't home yet, and Adeline never told her that he had died long ago. She only said he was still busy and that Rosalind should have her tea while she waited. But Rosalind was no longer afraid. She no longer looked at the person standing in her room as though she were a stranger. And on the 22nd night, for the first time in months, Rosalind slept straight through from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. She didn't wake once, and she didn't step into the hallway once. Adeline knew because she had stayed overnight, and she had awakened 3 times to check on her, and all 3 times Rosalind had been sleeping peacefully. The following afternoon, the 2 women sat beside the window, singing the old song, and halfway through, Rosalind forgot the words so completely that she began laughing at herself, a low, throaty laugh that grew until she had to cover her mouth with one hand. Adeline laughed with her. She didn't know how long Emmett had been standing in the doorway. When she turned, she saw him there, one hand still holding the coat draped over his arm, standing perfectly still without entering the room. He looked at his mother. She's laughing, he said. Then he turned and walked down the stairs, and when he was halfway down, Adeline heard him speak one more sentence, not to her, but to himself. I'd forgotten what that laugh sounded like. Cyrus Dunn didn't stop by the diner the following week, as he'd said he would. He made her wait another 3 weeks, and Adeline understood that this, too, was a way of doing business, giving people enough time to imagine the worst things possible before you finally appeared. He was waiting outside Ruby's at 11:30 that night, just as she finished locking the door, and after Pike had already gone home. This time, he wasn't carrying the stack of papers. You look better than you did last month, he said. I hear you've got a new job. Big house up in Roland Park. Adeline didn't ask where he'd heard it. She slipped the keys into her pocket and stood still. How much are they paying you an hour? He asked. Enough to pay you on time. On time is on time, Dunn said with a thoughtful nod. But have you figured out when you'll actually be finished? Every time you pay off part of it, the interest grows by exactly as much as you've just paid. You're only walking in circles. 3 years from now, you'll still be standing right here, holding that same ring of keys, and I'll still be standing here too. He paused for a moment. Little Junie will probably be 22 by then. Adeline raised her head. What did you just say? I said little Junie, Dunn repeated, still speaking in that same calm, courteous voice. She's doing quite well with her walking exercises. I happened to pass through there last week and saw her practicing in the hallway. It's a good rehabilitation center. I'll give them that. The only trouble is, it's expensive. When a place is expensive, the bills have to be paid regularly. And for them to be paid regularly, someone has to step forward. If there comes a month when no one pays, they transfer the patient somewhere else. You know how it works. They can't keep her there. You stay away from my sister. I haven't done anything, he said, raising both hands. I'm only talking. 3 evenings a week, Miss Mercer. You sit and keep the books. I erase the debt, and everyone sleeps easier." Adeline remained silent for a moment. Then she stepped closer, near enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. "I'll repay my debt," she said. "Every cent of it, on time, even if it takes me 5 years. But I won't pay it with myself. And if you ever say my sister's name again, I'll take your stack of papers somewhere you won't like." Dunn looked at her. He wasn't angry. He simply watched her with the expression of a man who had just added another line to a ledger. "I like you," he said. "People like you are rare. It's only a shame that people like you usually wear themselves out early." Then he walked away. Adeline stood leaning against the metal shutter for a long time before she could make herself start walking home. Only 2 people should have known what had happened. But that night, Amos Teague was waiting at the end of the street with the car. The week before, Emmett had instructed him to pick her up at 11:30 whenever she was staying overnight at the house. Adeline had told Amos she could walk by herself, but he came anyway. He came every night, parking some distance from the diner without sounding the horn. He sat inside the car, and he saw everything. The next morning, he told Emmett what had happened in the study. He kept it brief, added nothing, and repeated even Dunn's final sentence. Emmett listened to all of it. Then he rose, walked around the desk, and reached for the telephone. Adeline was upstairs with Rosalind. She heard the scrape of a chair below, and guided by an instinct she could never explain afterward, she took out her phone and sent Emmett a single word: "Don't." Downstairs, Emmett held the telephone in his hand and watched his screen light up. Amos stood beside him, waiting. He had stood beside this man for 11 years, and in all those years, he had never seen anyone make Emmett stop. It wasn't because people didn't dare tell him to. It was because he had never listened. Emmett read that one word. He didn't ask why, didn't send a reply, and didn't call upstairs. He placed the telephone on the desk, sat back down, and asked Amos to leave him alone. Amos walked out and closed the door, but he remained in the hallway for several seconds because he had just understood something no one else in that house had yet understood. The woman upstairs owed his employer nothing. She didn't beg, didn't accept gifts, didn't take advances on her wages, and didn't ask questions. And that was the first time in Emmett Falcone's life that he had obeyed someone like her. 40 minutes outside the city, there was a roadside diner where no one knew anyone, and that was the place Bram Kessler chose to meet Dr. Vaughn Keeler one Wednesday afternoon. They both ordered coffee, and neither of them touched it. Bram placed a printed sheet of paper on the table. It wasn't a contract, only a single page listing several phrases, and he pushed it across. "I need a written assessment," Bram said. "It doesn't need to be long. It only needs to use the right words." Keeler skimmed the page. "Legally incapacitated. No longer capable of making independent financial decisions. Requires a court-appointed guardian of the estate." He set the paper down. "She's improving. She forgets her own son's name. Those are 2 different things." "Not in court," Bram said. "In court, the only thing that matters is your signature." Keeler picked up his coffee cup, then set it down again. "What does Mr. Falcone think about this?" "He's young, he's busy, and he's allowing a stranger to sleep beneath his roof," Bram said. "I've looked after this family for 15 years. I know where to place the support before the structure collapses." Keeler didn't ask another question. He folded the paper in half and slipped it into his case, and Bram called for the check and paid for them both. Later that same week in Roland Park, Keeler opened Rosalind's medical record in front of Adeline and 3 other people during the regular care conference. He presented a new treatment plan: tea at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, precisely on time, without deviation. Eliminate the morning card sorting exercise entirely and replace it with unstructured conversation. Stop forcing the patient to remember dates. Play music in the late afternoon, preferably songs the patient had known since childhood. Never correct the patient in front of a third person. Adeline sat in silence and listened. It was everything she had been doing for the past 8 weeks, line by line, including the 4 o'clock tea time, including the instruction never to correct Rosalind in front of a third person, which Adeline had written in those exact words in a note she'd left for the night shift. At the bottom of the plan were Vaughn Keeler's signature and that week's date. He closed the medical record and said he had treated this patient for many years and understood her better than anyone else. Someone in the room praised him, saying the plan sounded remarkably compassionate. Adeline lowered her eyes to the 2 hands resting in her lap. She said nothing. After the meeting, Keeler asked her to remain behind in the hallway. "Starting next week, You won't need to attend these meetings anymore, he said. Everything discussed here is clinical, and sitting through it only wastes your time. I'm the person who stays with her 10 hours a day. You're a credentialed domestic worker, Miss Mercer, Keeler said without raising his voice or sounding deliberately cruel. He said it as though he were reading a line from a file. Just continue doing your part well. Then he walked away. Adeline remained in the hallway for a while. She thought about running after him and demanding an explanation. She thought about knocking on the study door downstairs and telling Emmett everything. And she knew that if she did, Keeler wouldn't set foot in that house again by the end of the day. But she also knew that she would no longer merely be the woman caring for Rosalind. She would become one of Emmett Falcone's people. And once you belonged to someone, everything you did afterward was interpreted differently. So she went upstairs, made tea at 4 o'clock, sat and sang with Rosalind as she did every day, and at 6 she returned to the diner for her night shift. That night, after locking the doors at Ruby's, she sat on the edge of her bed and took out her mother's cloth-bound notebook. It was old, its spine worn thin, and inside were nearly 200 pages written by a night shift nurse who had died 6 years earlier. Brief entries, recording dates, times, patients' names, and sometimes a private thought of her own. Adeline turned to the first blank page. She wrote down that day's date, the time she had served the tea, the time Rosalind had fallen asleep, and the time she had awakened. She recorded what time Rosalind had taken each prescribed medication and who had opened the medicine cabinet. She wrote down how many lines of the song Rosalind had managed to sing. She recorded the meeting that afternoon and the name of the person whose signature appeared at the bottom of the treatment plan. Then she read it over, closed the notebook, and placed it at the bottom of her canvas bag. From that day forward, she wrote in it every night. She didn't tell anyone she was keeping those records, and for many months, she never asked herself what she was keeping them for. The printed notice about the examination to reinstate her certification remained in Adeline's canvas bag for nearly 3 weeks before she dared to open it and read it a second time. She had taken it from the bulletin board in the hallway of Junie's rehabilitation center, folded it into quarters the way she always folded money, and left it there. It stated that anyone who had left their studies unfinished could register to take the examination again within 10 years of leaving school, followed by a list of required documents, a fee, and 2 examinations held 7 weeks apart. She had calculated that fee so many times she knew the amount by heart, and every time she finished calculating it, she put the paper away again. On Friday afternoon, when Adeline carried the tea tray down to the kitchen, Emmett was sitting at the dining table with a stack of files. The paper slipped from her apron pocket when she bent down to pick up a spoon. He reached it first, glanced over the first line, then handed it back without asking a question. Adeline took it, and she should have walked away, but for some reason she remained where she was. "I'm planning to apply," she said. "Eventually. I've been planning to for 3 weeks." Emmett closed the file in front of him. "What are you missing?" "Nothing." She looked at the paper in her hand. "I'm afraid." The words sounded strange once she had spoken them, because she had never said that to anyone, not even Junie, especially not Junie. "It's been 6 years. I left halfway through my final year, and there are subjects I can barely remember the names of. I'm nearly 30 now. I work 2 shifts a day. When am I supposed to study? If I fail, that fee is gone, and it's exactly 2 weeks of my sister's expenses." Emmett said nothing for several seconds. "Are you afraid you'll fail, or are you afraid you'll pass?" he asked. Adeline couldn't answer that question. "Be afraid if you need to be," he said, "but apply. You don't understand." "I don't need to understand. I only know you've carried that paper around for 3 weeks and still haven't thrown it away." Then he reopened the file and returned to his work. He didn't say another word about the fee, didn't reach for his wallet, and didn't offer her anything. And Adeline understood that he was honoring the 3rd condition she herself had set. She submitted her application the following Monday. The fee came from the wages she had saved over 3 months at Roland Park, setting aside a little each month in a glass jar beneath the sink. From that day forward, she studied during the hours other people used for sleep. From 11:30 at night, after locking the doors at Ruby's, until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. On the Sunday morning bus to visit her sister, she tucked the study guide between 2 pages of her notebook. On afternoons when Rosalind slept, she sat in the chair beside the window in Rosalind's room with a book open on her lap, and every time the old woman stirred, Adeline looked up. Twice, she fell asleep over her book and awakened to the sound of Rosalind calling her Colette. She took the first examination on a Saturday morning and walked about 1.25 miles to the testing center because there were no buses running that early. She left the examination room certain she had answered at least 4 questions incorrectly. 7 weeks later came the second examination. The results arrived by email on a Thursday afternoon, and Adeline opened the message while standing in the kitchen at Roland Park with the kettle boiling behind her. She read it 3 times. Then she turned off the stove, sat down in a chair, and remained perfectly still for a long while. Emmett passed the kitchen doorway, saw her sitting there, and stopped. "You passed?" Adeline nodded. She meant to tell him her score and explain which section she had nearly failed, but he didn't ask. He simply nodded once, only once, like a man hearing something he had known all along. "You're not surprised at all," Adeline said. "No. Why not? I'm surprised." Emmett stood in the kitchen doorway with one hand in his pocket. "I once watched you give away the last thing you had," he said, "to someone you didn't even know, on a night when you had nothing left yourself. What's so difficult about an examination?" Then he walked away. Adeline remained seated in the kitchen beside the silent kettle, and only then did she realize that her eyes were wet. She wiped them quickly before anyone could see. Adeline awoke at 1:45 because of the silence. During the 2 months she had been sleeping in this house, she had grown so accustomed to hearing Rosalind turn over on the other side of the wall that when the sound was no longer there, she bolted upright before she even had time to think. Rosalind's room was empty. The blanket was neatly folded at the edge of the bed. Her slippers were still beneath it, and the window was closed. Adeline ran downstairs, checked the kitchen, the living room, and the study, then pounded on Emmett's bedroom door. He came out 7 seconds later, still wearing the shirt he had worn during the day, and he didn't ask what was wrong. He only looked at her face and reached for his keys. The side door leading into the garden was unlocked. Amos was awakened and sent in one direction by car. Emmett and Adeline went on foot in the other direction, down the hill toward the streets leading to the harbor, because Adeline said people often returned to places they had once gone every day, not to the place where they lived now. Emmett didn't question her. He simply turned in the direction she indicated. They walked 3 blocks without speaking. At every intersection, Adeline stopped, looked in all 4 directions, called out once, then stood still and listened. There was nothing. After the 4th block, Emmett began to speak, and he wasn't speaking merely to fill the silence. He spoke like a man who had carried something inside himself for far too long. "I had an older brother once," he said. "Ansel. He was 6 years older than I was." Adeline kept walking, her eyes still searching both sides of the street. "He died when he was 19. He'd been in the hospital for 7 weeks before that. I was 13, and they wouldn't let me into his room at night, so I sat in the hallway." He stepped across a puddle. "On his last night, my mother wasn't there. She had gone home to shower and change her clothes. She was only supposed to be gone for a little while. By the time she came back, she was 40 minutes too late." Adeline stopped at the next corner, called out once more, then continued walking. 40 minutes, Emmett said. "It's been more than 20 years. She forgets my name, forgets what year her husband died, even forgets the house she lives in, but she doesn't forget those 40 minutes. Some nights she wakes up and says she has to go, that she has to leave right away, that there isn't a moment to lose. When I ask where she needs to go, she can't tell me." He was silent for a while. "They told me this illness erases everything in reverse order. The newest memories disappear first, and the oldest ones are the last to go. If that's true, then the final thing left in my mother's mind will be that night." Adeline said nothing because she couldn't find a response that didn't sound hollow, and she thought silence would be kinder. They searched for nearly 2 more hours. They passed through the warehouse district, followed the road beside the abandoned railroad tracks, doubled back, and turned down narrow side streets. A little before 3 o'clock, Adeline stopped at the entrance to a street and looked toward the row of yellow lights at the far end. "The bus station," she said. Rosalind was sitting there on a bench beneath the shelter, both hands resting neatly in her lap, her back straight, sitting exactly like someone who was waiting and knew with absolute certainty that the bus would come. She turned to look at the 2 of them approaching and didn't seem surprised at all. "Rosalind," Adeline said as she sat down beside her, "what are you waiting for out here?" "I'm waiting until it's time to start my shift. What else would I be waiting for?" Rosalind replied, sounding mildly irritated. "You know they dock your pay if you're late." Adeline looked at her. Then she nodded. "They changed the schedule today," she said. "They sent word this afternoon. You must not have heard. We can go home now." Rosalind considered that for a moment, then said, "Oh, did they?" and held out her hand so Adeline could help her stand. She said her feet were cold. Emmett took off his coat and handed it to Adeline, and Adeline draped it around Rosalind's shoulders. The three of them walked back up the hill because Amos was still searching on the other side of the city. After they had gone some distance, Rosalind forgot what had just happened and began telling them about a garden somewhere with a pear tree. She described it in great detail, and Adeline murmured along at every pause. Emmett walked one step behind the two women. When they were nearly home, he spoke in a voice just loud enough for Adeline to hear. "The 4 people before you all told her there wasn't any shift." Adeline didn't turn around. "I know," she said. "You're the first person who didn't try to correct her." Adeline continued supporting Rosalind's arm as the older woman climbed the front steps, and she didn't answer him. But that night, after settling Rosalind into bed and pulling the blanket over her, Adeline remained seated in the darkness for a very long time, and inside her mind, the same words echoed over and over. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The final thing left inside a person's mind. Adeline learned about it on a Tuesday afternoon, when she carried the tray downstairs and past the study door, which had been left slightly open. On the desk beneath Emmett's hand was a copy of the papers she had signed 2 years earlier. She recognized them at once, recognized the crease in the upper corner, and she stopped dead in the hallway with the tray still in her hands. Emmett looked up. He didn't hide the papers, didn't close the case, and showed no reaction at all. "Come in," he said. She set the tray on the edge of the desk. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter." "It matters to me." "I know," he said, "but something else matters more right now." He turned the papers around so she could see them, then placed his telephone face down on the desk. A very small gesture, but Adeline understood immediately what it meant. 3 minutes, Emmett said. "You sit here, I make 2 calls, and by tonight, this no longer exists. I'm not paying your debt for you. This paper will disappear from every place where it's being kept, and the person holding it will never mention your name again. You won't have to do anything. You won't have to sign anything, and you won't owe me." Adeline looked at the telephone lying face down on the desk. She had imagined this moment countless times over the past 2 years, imagined how it would feel to wake the next morning without that burden hanging over her head, and now freedom stood only 3 minutes away. She felt the strength begin to leave her legs. "How are you planning to do it?" she asked. "You told me you didn't want to know what I do for a living. Now I'm asking how you're planning to do it." Emmett was silent. "You can't answer," Adeline said. "Not because you don't know, but because if you tell me, I'll have to hear it. And once I've heard it, I won't be able to pretend I didn't." She reached across the desk and placed her hand over the back of his, just as he was about to pick up the telephone, and held it there. "Don't. This isn't a large matter. Not to you. To me, it's everything." Adeline withdrew her hand. "I've lived with that paper for 2 years. I've walked instead of taking the bus. I've started learning everything again at night, after working 2 shifts. I've stood before a man and told him no, and I've paid for that no with nights spent lying awake, wondering where I would find the money for the next month. Those are the only things I have. If you erase this in 3 minutes, you won't be saving me. You'll only be taking those things away. Your burden will be lighter." "It will," she said, "and from tomorrow onward, every time I accomplish something, I'll wonder whether I did it myself or whether I did it because of you. Every time someone treats me kindly, I'll wonder whether they're being kind to me or being kind to one of your people. Everyone in this house already looks at me that way. All you have to do is pick up that telephone, and they'll be right." Emmett said nothing. "If you fix this for me," Adeline said, "then for the rest of my life, I'll only be someone who belongs to you. I won't be myself." The only sound left in the study was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Emmett Falcone sat motionless behind the desk, his hand still resting beside the telephone lying face down, and he thought about how many people had entered this room over the past 11 years. Some had begged, some had bargained, some had cried, some had stood there speaking eloquently about morality, only to name a price in the end. No one had ever told him not to. Then he picked up the papers, folded them, and held them across the desk to her. "They're yours," he said. Adeline took them. "What about the original? It's still where it was. I haven't touched it. Do you promise? I don't make many promises, Emmett said, but I promise you this. She picked up the tray and walked out. When she reached the door, he called after her. Miss Mercer. She turned her head. If there ever comes a day when you change your mind, he said, just tell me. You won't need to give me a reason. That day will never come. I know. That night, Adeline returned to the diner for her usual night shift. Emmett went out and sat alone on the back porch without turning on the light. Amos passed by twice, once at 11 o'clock and again near 2 in the morning, and both times Emmett was still sitting in the same place with nothing in his hands. Amos didn't ask. He simply stood in the kitchen doorway and looked outside for a while before going to bed, because in the 11 years he had served this household, this was the first time he had ever seen his employer remain still after someone refused him, instead of finding another way to do what he wanted anyway. It happened on an ordinary afternoon after tea time, when Rosalind suddenly rose and walked over to the low cabinet in the corner of the room, then pulled a leather-bound album from its bottom drawer. She carried it back to her chair, settled it in her lap, and opened it with hands that trembled yet moved with such practiced ease that Adeline understood she had done this countless times throughout her life, even on days when she couldn't remember whose house she was in. Rosalind turned through the first few pages quickly without looking, then stopped at a page near the middle and placed her finger upon it. In the photograph was a thin, dark-haired boy sitting on the front steps with a ball at his feet. Ansel, she said. My eldest son. Adeline sat down in the chair beside her. He was handsome, wasn't he? He was thin, Rosalind said. He hardly ate at all. After 7 weeks in that place, there was almost nothing left of him. She raised 2 fingers as though measuring a narrow space in the air, then lowered her hand. There was a nurse who worked the night shift. She sang to him, every night for 7 weeks without missing a single one. He couldn't sleep unless someone sang to him. Adeline sat in silence. I wasn't there on the final night, Rosalind said. I only went home to change my clothes. By the time I returned, I was 40 minutes too late. She slowly stroked the face in the photograph, her finger passing over the same place again and again. She held his hand for me. That's what they told me. She sat there until it was completely over, and only then did she leave the room. Then Rosalind turned toward Adeline and began again from the beginning, repeating every word exactly, in the way of someone whose story had worn a deep groove into her mind. The nurse sang to him for 7 weeks. On the final night, I was 40 minutes too late. She held his hand for me. Adeline listened to the entire story 3 times. On the third telling, she rose, went into her room, and took the cloth-bound notebook from the bottom of her canvas bag. She carried it back, sat down beside Rosalind again, and began turning through it from the end. She had carried that notebook for 6 years, without ever reading it all the way through. She had leafed through it, breathed in its scent, and continued writing in the blank pages at the back. But she had never sat down and read every line, because whenever she tried, she felt something close across her chest and stop her. Now she worked backward through pages filled with dates, patients' names, hours, and lines of small, slanting handwriting. She turned past 9 pages. On the 10th page from the end, between 2 ordinary entries, there was a name, Ansel Falcone. Beside it were a date and a time. And beneath that, set apart from everything else, was a line her mother had written for herself, never intending anyone else to read it. Adeline read the line, then she read it again. Beside her, Rosalind was still stroking the photograph and still saying softly to herself that the boy couldn't sleep unless someone sang to him. Adeline closed the notebook. She laid it in her lap, rested both hands upon it, and sat perfectly still. Outside the window, the day was fading into late afternoon. She said nothing. She thought about that night at the diner, when a confused old woman had turned her head in the middle of the room and called her by that name, and Adeline had told herself there must be thousands of women in the world named Colette. She thought about her first morning in this house, when Rosalind had taken her hand and asked why she hadn't worked the night shift in so long. She thought about how Rosalind never recognized Adeline when she stood silently, only when she spoke, only when she sang. Rosalind didn't remember faces. She hadn't remembered anyone's face in 2 years. She remembered voices, and Adeline's voice was exactly like her mother's, so much so that when her mother was alive, she would answer the telephone and laugh, as she said people were always confusing the two of them. 14 years earlier, in a hospital corridor somewhere in this city, one woman had sat and sung for 7 weeks to another woman's son, and both women had reached the end of their lives without ever knowing that a thread had been tied between their two families. Adeline sat there for a very long time. Then she rose, returned the notebook to the bottom of her canvas bag, and went downstairs to make Rosalind a fresh cup of tea, because the first one had long since gone cold. Rosalind had an appointment that day at a clinic near the harbor, and Amos drove all three of them there, with Emmett in the front seat and Adeline sitting beside the older woman in the back. Traffic came to a standstill on the road running along the water because a truck had stopped across the entrance to gate number 2. Behind the fence, 6 cranes were operating, each one lifting, turning, and lowering, and the roar of the machinery could be heard clearly even inside the car. 3 men stood near the gate arguing, and one of them noticed the car. He left the argument behind, walked over to the fence, and looked through the front window. Emmett lowered the glass. He didn't say a word. He merely gave the man one very small nod, then raised the window again. The man turned, hurried back inside, and lifted his hand to make some kind of signal toward the control booth. Less than 2 minutes later, all 6 cranes stopped, not one crane at a time. All 6. Their arms froze in midair with cargo still hanging beneath them, and the machinery fell silent one piece at a time, until the only sound left was the water striking the seawall. Dozens of men on the ground looked up, then stopped working as well, and not one of them asked why. Adeline sat motionless in the back seat, with Rosalind's hand resting in hers. The older woman was pointing through the window and talking about the birds. The truck blocking the road was moved aside. Amos shifted gears, and the car continued on. No one inside said a single word about what had just happened. At the clinic, while Rosalind was inside, Adeline sat in the waiting area and took out her telephone. She searched for the name Falcone, not under the news results but among the images, and spent a long time scrolling. Then she called Junie's Rehabilitation Center, asked to speak with the billing department, and inquired again about the payments that had been made in cash over the past several months. The person on the other end asked her to hold. When they returned, they said an older gentleman had come in to make the payments and had left a telephone number in case the hospital ever needed confirmation. Adeline asked for the number. She stared at the string of digits on the screen and recognized it, because it was the number for the house in Roland Park, the one posted on the refrigerator in the kitchen in case of an emergency. That evening, she didn't go to the diner. She sent Mr. Pike a message asking for the night off, the first time she had done so in 4 years, then sat in the kitchen at Roland Park and waited for Emmett to come home. He arrived a little before 10 o'clock, and when he saw the kitchen light still burning, he stepped inside. Is she asleep? Since 9 o'clock. Adeline placed her telephone on the table, the number still displayed on the screen. What month did you start paying for my sister? Emmett looked at the screen. He didn't deny it, and he didn't ask how she had found out. The 2nd month you worked here. How many months has it been? 7. Do you remember the 3rd condition I gave you? I do. You remembered, and you did it anyway. Yes. Adeline stood. She remained on the other side of the kitchen table, with both hands braced against its surface. Do you know what's funny? She said. For the past 7 months, every time I visited my sister, I thought there was some kind person somewhere helping us, without wanting anyone to know. I thought about that person often. Some nights, I lay awake because I was too grateful to sleep. It turns out that person was sitting 6 feet away from me at breakfast every morning and never said a word. I knew you wouldn't accept it. So you thought I was stupid? I thought you would leave, Emmett said. Adeline fell silent. You would pay the money back, quit your job, and tell yourself that was the only way to make things fair. Then you would return to the diner for the night shift, walk 1.25 miles on Sunday mornings, and my mother would go back to staring at a stranger in her room. He looked at her. I was afraid you would leave if you knew. Fear doesn't turn a lie into kindness, Adeline said. The words fell between them in the middle of the kitchen, and neither of them reached down to pick them up. Emmett didn't argue. He pulled out a chair and sat down, and he sat like a man who knew he had just lost something. Adeline remained standing for a while longer. Then she asked the question she had been carrying inside herself for weeks, the question she had held since the night she heard those 4 words at the top of the stairs, the question she had carried through that afternoon as all 6 cranes stood motionless. My father worked at the harbor, she said. He died in the fire at warehouse number 9, 8 years ago. They told us he went back inside to find 2 men from the night shift and never came out again. She looked directly at Emmett. Who owned the land that warehouse stood on? Emmett didn't answer. He sat perfectly still for a very long time, both hands resting on the table, and of all the things Adeline had ever seen in this man, nothing had frightened her more than the fact that, for the first time, he had no words at all. 3 days later, another car stopped at the gate at 10 o'clock in the morning, an hour when Emmett wasn't home, and Adeline understood at once that the visitor had deliberately chosen that time. The elderly woman entered without waiting for anyone to show her the way, walked straight into the sitting room on the ground floor, settled into her customary seat, and told Amos to close the door for her. Amos glanced at Adeline before pulling it shut. "I'm Marguerite Falcone," the older woman said. "Emmett's father was my brother. It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am. Sit down." Adeline sat on the edge of the chair opposite her. Marguerite looked her over slowly and openly, in exactly the same way Bram Kessler had looked at her in the hallway on her first morning, and Adeline suddenly realized that everyone in this house had the same way of studying strangers. "My sister-in-law has been sleeping better since you arrived," she said. I asked Amos. "He's too old to lie convincingly anymore." "I'm glad to hear that." "So am I." She opened the handbag resting in her lap, took out a small checkbook, and wrote in it for about 15 seconds. Then she tore out the check, folded it in half, and pushed it across the table toward Adeline. "Take this." Adeline didn't reach for it. "What are you giving it to me for?" "Because you've done well," Marguerite said. "And because I want you to understand something before it becomes a problem for everyone." She rested both hands on her handbag. "You're a charming accident, Miss Mercer." "I don't mean that as an insult. You truly are charming. A decent, sensible young woman who has worked her way up from nothing. The sort of person anyone would find endearing. But Emmett is caught in the middle of things you couldn't possibly imagine. And in those matters, no one needs a decent young woman. They need other things. Could you be more specific?" "Yes," she said. "I want you to leave. Resign properly, give us enough time for the transition, and I'll find your replacement myself. I'll make certain they know to prepare tea at 4 o'clock. The amount on that check is enough to pay everything you owe, enough to keep your sister where she is for another 2 years, and enough for you to open some little place of your own if that's what you want." Adeline looked at the folded piece of paper lying between them. She didn't open it to see the amount, nor did she need to, because she knew people like Marguerite Falcone didn't write small numbers. They wrote a number once, and considered the matter finished. She sat silently for several seconds. Then she rose, walked over to the small table in the corner, and poured tea from the pot into 2 cups. She carried one over, and placed it in front of Marguerite exactly the way Rosalind liked hers, with the handle turned toward the right hand and the spoon resting beside the cup instead of inside it. Then she sat down again. "Do you know what Rosalind calls me?" she asked. "I do. She calls everyone by someone else's name. She calls me Colette," Adeline said. "That was my mother's name." Marguerite froze with the teacup halfway to her lips. "My mother was a night shift nurse. She died 6 years ago. I wasn't planning to tell anyone about this, and I have no intention of using it to ask for anything. I'm only telling you so you'll understand that I didn't end up sitting in this chair by accident." She reached out and pushed the check back across the table, gently, until it touched the older woman's handbag. "I won't take money from a family whose memories I've been entrusted to protect," she said. "Take it back. Perhaps one day you'll need it to buy something you've never understood." Marguerite set down her teacup. She studied Adeline for a long while, and something in her gaze had changed. It wasn't affection, not yet, but the wary attention of someone who had just realized she had badly misjudged a piece on the board. She picked up the check, tore it neatly in half, and slipped both pieces into her handbag. "Do you know how many people have refused me in all the decades I've lived in this house?" she asked. "I imagine there haven't been many." "There hasn't been a single one," Marguerite said. She rose and slipped the handbag over her arm. When she reached the door, she stopped without turning around. "Be careful," she said. "Not everyone in this house will simply hand you a piece of paper and walk away." Then she left. Adeline remained there alone with the 2 cups of tea, one partly empty and the other untouched, and she stayed that way until she heard Rosalind calling for Colette from the 2nd floor. The court papers arrived at the house by certified mail on a Thursday morning, and Amos was the one who signed for them. He carried the envelope upstairs to the study, placed it on the desk, then remained standing there instead of leaving, something he had never done before. Emmett opened it and read. It was a petition to appoint a conservator for the estate of Rosalind Falcone. The petitioner was Bram Kessler, whose 15 years managing the family's affairs were clearly stated in the document. Attached was a medical assessment bearing Von Keeler's signature, written with precisely the phrases such a petition required, and in the section explaining the grounds for emergency action, 3 paragraphs concerned the caregiver living in the house. They alleged that she wasn't related to the family, had been hired without following proper procedure, had unilaterally altered the patient's care regimen against the doctor's instructions, had fostered emotional dependence in the patient by encouraging her to call the caregiver by the name of a deceased loved one, and had shown signs of attempting to gain access to the family estate for her own benefit. Adeline Mercer's name appeared 7 times. Emmett read the entire document. Then he read it again, more slowly. Amos was still standing there. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Emmett folded the papers, set them down, and said nothing. The Falcone family's attorney filed an objection the following afternoon. 3 weeks later, the court issued notice that consideration of the petition had been postponed because the filing was incomplete, specifically because it lacked an evaluation of Rosalind's mental capacity by an independent specialist who wasn't affiliated with the doctors currently treating her. The petitioner was granted leave to supplement the filing. No new date had been set. Adeline read the notice alone in the kitchen, then folded it, and continued making tea. What frightened her wasn't the word postponed. It was the words granted leave to supplement. From the day the envelope arrived, Emmett never spoke another word to Bram Kessler. It wasn't as though he avoided him. Bram still came to the house, still entered the study, and still placed files on the desk as he did every week. Emmett still accepted them, read them, and signed wherever his signature was required. But he no longer asked Bram any questions, no longer entrusted him with any work, and whenever Bram spoke, Emmett listened until he was finished, gave a single nod, then lowered his head and returned to whatever he had been doing. It went on that way for 3 weeks. Then Adeline began noticing unfamiliar people coming to the house, people Bram didn't recognize, and once she saw Bram standing in the hallway, watching one of them walk away with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the lock on his own office door had been changed without his knowing when. On Wednesday afternoon, Adeline was carrying a tray down to the kitchen when she found Amos sitting there polishing the car keys. He looked up. "Have you ever seen him angry?" he asked. "No, I've seen it twice in 11 years. Both times, there was shouting and pounding on the desk, and by the next morning, everything was back to normal." He set the ring of keys down. Neither occasion amounted to anything. They were both minor matters. "It isn't when he shouts that you should be frightened," Adeline stopped. "It's when he goes silent that people ought to be afraid," Amos said. "Remember that for me. I don't mean afraid for yourself. I mean afraid for whoever is standing opposite him." Then he picked up the keys and walked out into the yard. That Sunday morning, Adeline went to visit Junie as usual. She took the number 31 bus, got off at the stop a short distance from the rehabilitation center, and walked the rest of the way. As she turned toward the parking lot entrance, she noticed a dark-colored car moving slowly behind her, traveling just a little more slowly than she was walking. She continued for several dozen steps, then stopped to retie her shoelace. The car stopped as well, about 100 feet away, and no one got out. She rose and kept walking until she reached the center's entrance, and before stepping through the glass doors, she turned her head. The car had backed into a parking space in the first row, with its front facing outward. The person inside hadn't turned off the engine. Adeline went in, sat down in the waiting area, and remained there for nearly 10 minutes before going upstairs to find her sister. She didn't call anyone. She simply opened her canvas bag, took out the cloth-bound notebook, and added one brief line to the page for that day, recording the time, the location, the color of the car, and the final 4 digits of the license plate she had managed to see. Everything came apart on Tuesday morning, when Keeler arrived to inspect the medicine cabinet and counted what remained inside. Something was missing. He called Bram. Bram called the attorney, and before 11 o'clock that morning, everyone in the house knew. The medication log lay in the cabinet drawer, and on the line recording the most recent withdrawal was Adeline Mercer's signature, accompanied by the date and time, 2:40 in the morning on the previous Saturday. Adeline was summoned to the sitting room on the ground floor. Keeler was there, Bram was there, along with the family attorney, 2 members of the care council, and Emmett, who sat silently in the corner. They handed her the logbook. She stared at the signature for a long time. It looked like hers, so much so that if she hadn't been Adeline herself, she would have believed it. "Do you have anything to say?" the attorney asked. Adeline lifted her eyes to Emmett. He was looking back at her, and she understood that all she had to do was give him a single nod, and within half an hour, everything would be settled. The logbook would disappear, the meeting would be brought to an end, and the man sitting there would never set foot in that house again. She shook her head, so slightly that he alone could see it. Emmett didn't move. "I have 3 requests," Adeline said. "Go ahead." "First, I wasn't in this house last Saturday night. My sister had a fever and needed to be monitored, so I sat in the hallway at the rehabilitation center from 11 o'clock that night until 6 o'clock the following morning. They have an overnight visitor log, staff members who were on duty, and hallway cameras. You're welcome to call and ask. Second, this house has cameras at the medicine cabinet door and at the entrance to the second-floor hallway. I ask that you retrieve the footage from that night. Not the part where I signed, because I didn't sign. The footage from 2 o'clock until 3 o'clock in the morning." Bram cleared his throat. "That system only keeps recordings for 14 days. Today is the 10th day," Adeline said. The room remained silent for a moment. "And the third?" Adeline opened her canvas bag, took out the cloth-bound notebook, and placed it on the table. "These are my records. I've been keeping them since my 2nd month working here. 1 page every night, without missing a single day. The time I make her tea, the time she falls asleep, the time she wakes, how much she eats, the days she cries, and the days she laughs, and every time she takes her prescribed medication. I write down the time and the name of the person who opened the cabinet. I'm not the person who keeps the key to that cabinet. I've never had it." The attorney drew the notebook toward himself and turned through several pages. His movements gradually slowed. "You've even written Dr. Keeler's name here. If he was the person who opened the cabinet, then I wrote down his name. Keeler said those were merely notes kept by a domestic employee and had no value." Adeline didn't argue. She only said that if that was true, then there was even more reason to compare her notes with the medication log in the cabinet and see whether the 2 records matched. The camera footage was retrieved that afternoon. There was no need to watch all of it. At approximately 2:38 on Saturday morning, the second-floor hallway door opened, and the person who entered was Vaughn Keeler. He walked straight to the cabinet, unlocked it, stood there for about 4 minutes, then closed it and left. No one else appeared at any point in the footage. Keeler sat silently for a long time. Then he began talking about routine inventory checks and his right to access the medicine cabinet at any hour, but his words came more slowly with each passing moment, and halfway through, he stopped altogether. The attorney closed the computer. The counsel decided to suspend Dr. Keeler immediately from his role in the patient's care, transfer all records to an independent party for review, and formally note that the allegations against Miss Mercer were without foundation. But there was one detail no one in the room mentioned, and Adeline had seen it the very first time they watched the footage. The second-floor hallway door could only be opened with a code. That code changed every month, and Vaughn Keeler's name wasn't on the list of people who had been given the code for that month. The footage showed him entering it in one continuous motion, without hesitating, and without making a single mistake. Someone had given him the code. Adeline picked up the notebook, returned it to her canvas bag, and left the room without saying a word about it, because she knew she had nothing in her hands yet, and because she had learned that speaking a truth before it could be proven only warned people which direction she was looking. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed and added another line to the page for that day, writing down the time shown in the footage and the question of who had provided the code. Then she closed the notebook and turned out the light. The envelope was placed directly into Adeline's hands on Friday afternoon, just outside Ruby's, delivered by a man on a motorcycle who rode away immediately without waiting for a signature. There was no sender's name on the outside. Inside were more than 40 photocopied pages, and on the first page was a small handwritten note containing only one line, telling her that she ought to know whose house she was living in. Adeline took it back to her apartment, sat down on the floor, and read every page over the next 2 hours. It was the file on warehouse number 9, the deed transferring the land 11 years earlier, the renovation contract, the inspection report for the fire alarm system and emergency exits, completed 14 months before the fire, stating that every component had met the required standards and had been approved for use. Then came the investigator's report after the fire, stating that the eastern emergency exit had already been sealed and that the alarm system in that section hadn't been working on the night of the fire. There was a list of everyone present on the night shift. 3 names had been marked. One of them was Wade Mercer. At the bottom of the inspection report, beneath the line designated for the property owner's representative, was a signature. Adeline didn't recognize the handwriting, but she recognized the typed name beneath it at once, because she had seen it on the photograph in the study at Roland Park, the photograph of a man standing beside Rosalind when she was young, Emmett's father, the man who had died 9 years earlier. She remained on the floor with the stack of papers in her lap until darkness had completely filled the apartment. On Saturday evening, she went to Roland Park even though she wasn't scheduled to work, and Amos opened the gate with the expression of a man who had already guessed why she had come. Emmett was in the study. Adeline placed the stack of papers on his desk without saying a word, and he picked it up and began to read. He read far faster than she had, with the practiced speed of someone who already knew what he was going to find. When he finished, he set the papers down. "Who gave these to you?" "That doesn't matter." "It does." "No," Adeline said. "Not right now." She stood on the other side of the desk. "That warehouse belonged to your family?" "Yes." "How long have you known?" "Since the night you asked me in the kitchen," Emmett said. "Before then, I didn't know your father's name was in the file." "But you knew the warehouse belonged to your family." "I did. And for 8 years, you never tried to find out why 3 men couldn't get out." He didn't answer. Adeline nodded. "I'm not asking whether you killed my father," she said. "I know you didn't. You weren't in control of anything back then." She placed both hands on the edge of the desk. "I'm asking whether your world killed him." Emmett remained silent. He could have said that it had been his father's doing. He could have said that documents could be forged, that whoever had sent her the file hadn't done so with good intentions, that someone was using her as a pawn, and every one of those things would have held some measure of truth. But he said none of them. "I can't tell you it didn't," he said. Adeline nodded again, very slowly. "I've stayed in this house for 9 months, she said. "For 9 months, I've made tea at 4 o'clock and sung to an old woman, and I truly care for her, not because I'm paid to, but for 9 months, I've also been learning not to hear the telephone calls that come in at night, learning not to ask why 6 cranes sometimes stop moving, learning to look the other way, and every time I look away, I lose a little more of myself." She lifted her hands from the desk. "If I stay any longer, one day I'll read that page with my father's name on it and find some way to convince myself that it doesn't matter. I don't want to become that kind of person. I don't have much, but I still have that." "Where will you go?" "Back to my apartment. I still have the night shift at the diner." "What about my mother?" Adeline was silent for a moment. "Find someone kind," she said. "Tell them to make her tea at 4 o'clock. Tell them never to say she's mistaken. And tell them to sing. She only needs someone to sing to her." Emmett rose. He walked around the desk and stopped 2 steps away from her, and Adeline realized that this was the first time in 9 months she had ever seen him unsure of what to do with his hands. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. "There's nothing I need you to do." "Then tell me what I need to become." Adeline looked at him. She had prepared so many words on the way there, and now not one of them could be used. "I don't know," she said, "but if I ever come back, it has to be because I choose you, not because I have nowhere else to go." Then she picked up her canvas bag and walked out. At the top of the staircase, she looked toward the 2nd floor one last time, at the bedroom door standing partly open, then turned away without going upstairs. Amos opened the gate for her. He didn't ask a single question. He only told her to be careful on her way home, and he stood there watching until she disappeared around the bend at the bottom of the hill. 11 days after Adeline left Roland Park, Amos called her at 6 o'clock in the evening. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Rosalind wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, had risen in the middle of the night and stood in the hallway for 3 nights in a row, and the new caregiver had resigned the day before. He said he wasn't asking her to come on anyone's behalf. He was only letting her know. Adeline asked Mr. Pike for the night off and took the bus there. She went straight upstairs without knocking. Rosalind was sitting on the edge of the bed in the darkness, both hands resting in her lap, and when Adeline called to her, she looked up and said, "Oh, there you are," in a perfectly ordinary voice, as though Adeline had merely stepped out to buy something. Adeline turned on the bedside lamp, tucked a blanket over Rosalind's legs, sat down in the chair beside her, and began to sing. Rosalind slept for half an hour before waking, and this time she woke differently. She sat upright, looked around the room once, then turned her eyes to Adeline, and her gaze was clear, clearer than Adeline had ever seen it in all the 9 months she had known her. "Miss Mercer," Rosalind said. Adeline remained still. It was the first time Rosalind had ever called her by the correct name. "His study downstairs," Rosalind said. "In the left corner, close to the wall, there's a loose floorboard. He kept a tin box underneath it. The records from that year, copies of them, he kept a copy." Adeline leaned closer. "What year, ma'am?" "The year the warehouse burned," she said. "He told me he had to keep a copy because that boy prepared it himself and brought it to him to sign. He told me twice." He was trembling when he said it. "Who was it?" "The boy who sits in that room every day," Rosalind said. "He thought I was sitting there like a piece of furniture. He spoke on the telephone right in front of me. He said everything. He never once even bothered to step outside. I never told anyone. Who would have believed me?" She paused. "I forget so many things, Miss Mercer. But some days, I can still hear. People always assume I can't." Then she fell silent. Adeline took her hand. "Look at me, ma'am. Which corner was the box in? Please show me again." Rosalind turned toward her, and in that brief moment, something withdrew from her eyes, slipping away completely, and she looked at Adeline with the faint confusion of someone trying to remember what she had just said. "Have you had your tea?" she asked. "It's gone cold. They made it this morning." Adeline sat without moving. She was still holding Rosalind's hand when she said, "Yes, ma'am. I'll make you another pot." Rosalind nodded and told her to make it weak, not too strong, then lay down again. 3 minutes later, she was asleep. Adeline went downstairs to the kitchen, stood there beside the kettle, and called Emmett. He answered after the first ring. She didn't greet him or ask how he was. "Come home," she said. "Come home now." Emmett arrived 40 minutes later. The two of them entered the dead man's study, the room at the end of the hallway that Adeline had never once stepped inside during the 9 months she had lived there, and went to the left corner near the wall. Emmett knelt and ran his fingers along the edges of the floorboards. The third board from the corner was loose. He lifted it. Beneath it, in the hollow between two beams, lay a flat tin box. Emmett took it out and opened the lid. Inside were several handwritten ledgers, a stack of invoices, and a bundle of yellowed reports. He began turning through them. In the middle of the papers was a proposal seeking approval for the renovation of Warehouse No. 9, and on that document were 2 signatures, one belonging to his father on the line for the property owner, and the other on the line for the person who had prepared the proposal, the man who had personally drafted it and submitted it for approval, Bram Kessler. Beneath that was the true construction expense report, not the version submitted to the inspectors, and on that report, 3 items had been crossed out in ink, with handwritten notes beside them in the margin: Eastern emergency exit, warehouse alarm system, routine maintenance. Emmett sank to the floor with the papers in his hands. For a very long time, he said nothing. Adeline stood leaning against the doorframe. "For 8 years, he sat 10 feet from this spot," she said. Emmett folded the papers. "Not 10 feet, he said. "He sat directly in front of my mother, every day, because he believed she had forgotten everything. He lifted his eyes to her, and I believed it too." Emmett didn't give the tin box to the family attorney. He called another lawyer, someone whose name appeared nowhere in any of the Falcone family's records, and the two of them spent 2 full days together in a rented office, away from the house. On the 3rd day, he submitted a request for a meeting with the federal prosecutor's office. Adeline learned about it from Amos. Emmett didn't tell her himself. The first meeting lasted 9 hours. He brought everything that had been inside the tin box, and he brought one more thing no one had asked for: the files documenting his own business dealings in the harbor over the previous 8 years, the parts that existed outside the law, the money that never appeared in any ledger, the names and the routes only he knew well enough to map out in full. His attorney tried to stop him 3 times. He turned everything over anyway. The agreement was signed 4 weeks later. Emmett Falcone agreed to cooperate fully, testify, and surrender every part of his illegal operations. He accepted years of supervision and the loss of most of the assets held in his name, and in return, he wouldn't have to serve time in prison. Amos told Adeline that on the day the agreement was signed, his employer came home, went straight upstairs to his room, and slept for 14 hours without waking, something that hadn't happened once in 11 years. 3 days later, Emmett summoned Cyrus Dunn. Dunn arrived wearing the expression of a man who believed he had been invited to discuss a partnership. He sat down and even managed to say a few things about how difficult times had become before Emmett placed a thin file on the table. It contained the documents transferring the entire portfolio of debts Dunn held. They had been signed the day before, paid in full, and were legal from beginning to end. Adeline Mercer's name was among them. Emmett removed the paper bearing her name, held it up so Dunn could see it, tore it in half, then tore it once more, and placed the pieces on the table before him. "She doesn't owe anyone anything," he said. Dunn stared at the scraps of paper. "Does she know you're doing this?" "No." "Then why are you doing it?" "It isn't for her to know." Emmett pushed the remaining file toward him. "There are more than 40 names left in here. As of today, they belong to me. You have nothing more to do with them." Dunn began talking about business, about the money he had invested, about how none of this was fair. Emmett listened until he was finished. "You're no longer permitted to set foot anywhere in the harbor," he said. "I don't mean one particular section. I mean all of it. Go ahead and test whether I'm joking." Then he rose and walked out, leaving Dunn alone in the room with the torn pieces of paper on the table. As for Bram Kessler, Emmett didn't say a single word to him. He didn't call him. He didn't question him. He made no mention of the tin box, the loose floorboard, or the renovation proposal bearing 2 signatures. For weeks, everything continued as though nothing had changed. Bram still came to the house every Tuesday, still placed the files on the desk, and still delivered his reports, while Emmett continued to accept them, read them, and sign them. On some days, Bram asked about the court proceedings and the conservatorship petition, and Emmett replied that the lawyers would handle it. On other days, Bram mentioned that they should find a new doctor to replace Keeler, and Emmett told him to go ahead and find one. Amos watched those meetings from the hallway many times, and each time a chill moved down his spine, because he knew that inside the desk drawer directly beneath his employer's hand lay a copy of something capable of ending an entire man's life. Yet Emmett continued sitting there, nodding at Bram as though nothing had happened. Adeline called Amos once and asked what Emmett intended to do. Amos said he didn't know. "But do you remember what I told you?" he asked. "I remember. This is what it looks like." Bram, for his part, noticed nothing during all that time. He saw only that Emmett was busy, that unfamiliar lawyers were coming and going from the house, and that the harbor operations were in turmoil. And he interpreted every one of those signs in the way that served him best. He believed this was the moment when the household was at its weakest. So he decided to accelerate the supplemental filing the court had requested, and he went looking for an independent specialist. The second assessment was conducted by a specialist who wasn't part of Rosalind's treatment team, just as the court had required, and that person met with her only once, for 40 minutes, on a morning when she couldn't even remember what season it was. The conclusion contained exactly the words Bram needed. The additional documents were filed on Monday, and by Thursday, the court had approved a temporary guardianship order, effective immediately, while awaiting a formal review hearing. Bram brought that order to Roland Park at 9 o'clock that night. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 men and a woman wearing a white medical coat, and he walked straight into the foyer because he still had the door code. Rosalind was asleep on the 2nd floor. She had been sleeping since 8:45, and her bedroom door was closed. Amos stepped forward to block the foot of the stairs. "Where is he?" Bram asked. "He isn't home." "Good." He held up the order. "I have the right to remove her from this house tonight. Read it." Amos didn't read it. He remained exactly where he was at the foot of the stairs. Bram gave a signal, and one of the 2 men stepped forward to push Amos aside. Footsteps sounded from the inner hallway. Emmett emerged, and behind him were 3 more men Bram had never seen inside this house before. The man approaching Amos was stopped before he could touch him, and forced back 2 steps. And that was the end of it. No one raised his voice. No one was hurt. The entire foyer remained motionless for several seconds, and Amos still stood at the foot of the stairs without moving. "You can't stop me," Bram said. "This is a court order." Emmett didn't answer. He only looked at him, and Bram began speaking faster, talking about how he had cared for this family for 15 years, how his sister-in-law needed professional care, and how Emmett was being manipulated without realizing it. He spoke for quite some time. Emmett still said nothing. Then the front door opened. Adeline walked in, still wearing her diner uniform, because she had come straight from Ruby's after Amos called her. She crossed the middle of the foyer, passing both of Bram's men, went to the small table against the wall, and placed a document on it. "Read this first," she said. Bram didn't pick it up. "Who are you to interfere in this family's affairs?" "I'm the person whose signature appears on the final line of that document," Adeline said. He picked it up. It was a receipt confirming that the federal prosecutor's office had accepted a body of evidence, stamped with that day's date at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Beneath it was an itemized list of every document that had been turned over. The original proposal seeking approval for the renovation of warehouse number 9, bearing the signature of the person who prepared it. The true construction expense report, with 3 items crossed out and handwritten notes in the margin. The property owner's handwritten ledgers. The camera footage from the second-floor hallway door, on the Saturday night of the 3rd week of the previous month. 4 months of the caregiver's handwritten care records, all originals. And on the final line, beneath the designation for the people who had surrendered the evidence, were 2 signatures, one belonging to Emmett Falcone and the other to Adeline Mercer. When Bram reached that line, his hand stopped. He read the document again from the beginning. The foyer was so silent that the faint trembling of the paper in his hand could be heard. "That box burned," he said. "He kept a copy," Adeline said. He told his wife twice. He was trembling when he said it. Bram looked up at Emmett. "How long have you known?" Emmett didn't answer. For weeks, he had accepted files from this man's hands, read them, signed them, nodded, and told him to go ahead and find a new doctor. While all that time, copies of everything had remained in the desk drawer less than an arm's length from where the 2 of them sat. Now Bram understood it all at once, and Adeline saw the realization appear on his face. The moment a man recognized that for weeks he had been walking confidently into a room whose every door had already been locked long before. He released the receipt, letting it fall onto the table. "I did those things for this family," he said. Emmett spoke only one sentence, the only words he addressed to this man throughout the entire evening. 3 people never made it out of that warehouse. The front door opened. Representatives from the prosecutor's office had been waiting outside in the courtyard, and they entered without haste. Bram didn't resist. He allowed them to take him away without saying another word, while the 2 men who had accompanied him stepped aside. The woman in the white coat picked up her bag and left. The temporary guardianship order remained on the small table beside the receipt, and the following morning, it was revoked. When the sound of the final car had faded beyond the gate, only 4 people remained in the foyer. Amos was still standing at the foot of the stairs. He looked up toward the 2nd floor. "She didn't wake," he said. "She slept through all of it." Adeline nodded. Then she went upstairs, opened Rosalind's bedroom door slightly, and stood there watching for a while. Rosalind was still asleep, both hands resting neatly upon the blanket, completely unaware that someone had come to take her away that night, and equally unaware that she herself was the person who had stopped it from happening. 1 year later, on a Friday evening at exactly 17 minutes past 8, the door to Ruby's opened. Emmett walked in, past 3 rows of tables, and stopped beside the table against the wall. Above it hung a small handwritten sign in Mr. Pike's slightly trembling script, the handwriting of a man who had grown old. "This table has already been paid for. Just sit down." Emmett took a $10 bill, folded into quarters from his coat pocket, placed it on the table, then sat at the counter and ordered a cup of black coffee, just as he did every week. Adeline poured it for him. That morning, she had returned from the rehabilitation center, where she had stood at the end of the hallway and watched Junie release her grip on the walker, take 7 steps on her own, then turn and smile at her older sister as though she had just done the most ordinary thing in the world. The Colette Mercer Night Nursing Fund had begun operating at 3 hospitals around the harbor that spring, paying the wages of those who remained beside patients during the hours when the rest of the city had gone to sleep, and Adeline's name was listed as its director. At Roland Park, Rosalind still forgot. She hadn't recovered, and she never would. Some afternoons, she asked where her husband had gone and why he wasn't home yet, and on other afternoons, she sat silently by the window without saying a word. But at 4 o'clock, there was always tea, and whenever someone began to sing, she turned her head, and she still called Adeline Colette. Adeline still answered. There are things we give at the very moment when almost nothing remains in our own hands, and only then do we truly give. Kindness isn't an investment. It promises no return to anyone, yet it always travels much farther than we imagine, so far that sometimes years pass before we discover where it has gone. Because what keeps a person standing has never been the money in their wallet, but what they still choose to do when that wallet is empty. If you believe that one small act of kindness can still change an entire life, please leave us a like and share this story with someone you think may need a little hope right now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us each day for new stories about kindness among ordinary people. And we would truly love to know how Adeline's story made you feel. Have you ever met someone who showed you kindness at the very moment when they had nothing left to give? Please leave a few words in the comments, because we genuinely want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with abundant health, happiness, and peace every day of your lives. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.